Thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's very dangerous to discuss politics in a normal environment, and certainly 2020 is one of those environments where it's even more dangerous. But we've received so many questions from clients and our advisors about what to do with their portfolios during the election. We thought, you know what, we're going to do what SEM always does. We're going to take a look at the data. We're going to explain the ways we're set up to handle it, and just basically try to take a non-political viewpoint of what's happening in the election so that you can make better decisions for yourself. Now, before we get started, I do want to leave time for Q&A at the end. If you should see a Q&A button on your screen, depending on what device you're using, you should be able to click that question button, ask those, and then we'll answer all of those at the end. Finally, what we love about Microsoft Teams is you should be able to hit the pause button and then come back and resume just like it's a DVR at home. So I have a whole lot of things to talk about here in the next 25 minutes, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, we've heard that this is the most important election of our lifetimes. I've heard that over and over again pretty much every time since I've been eligible to vote. But it is something that I think this year more than ever we are seeing that people are interested in the election. In fact, using data from the midterm elections in 2018, voter registration data, we should expect a turnout greater than we've ever seen in our voting lifetimes, taking us all the way back to the 1960s. And you could see 2016, we had a very low turnout. In fact, 100 million registered voting aged people did not vote in 2016. So 100 million people potentially now entering the voter pool that just weren't there in 2016. Now, one thing that we deal with critically from an investment standpoint is, does the president really matter? And Hartford Funds did a survey of people, and they found in this year, 93% of the people believe that who's president does matter when it comes to stock market returns, which is significantly bigger than what we saw going into the 2016 election. However, the data shows a completely different story. So when you look at all these presidential elections, going back to the 1790s, you see that on average, all kinds of different makeups of just a Republican president, Democratic president, split Congress with a Republican and then split Congress with a Democrat, as well as sweeps. The only one that truly showed an outperformance was a Democratic president with a split Congress. Now, before you start jumping to conclusions and say, oh, that means if Joe Biden wins and Congress is split, I'm going to go ahead and just jump into the market and put everything in stocks because that's best. Keep in mind, the only times we've seen that happen on the right is during the Clinton and Obama years, during their second term, when, as you know, we already had a lot of momentum in the economy and a lot of momentum going for the stock market. So I take that statistic with a grain of salt to just say the data shows it truly doesn't matter over the 4-year cycle who really wins. Now, what we may see happening is a couple different paths. And the average election year, Ned Davis Research put together this chart, and I love it. And the two lines we're focusing on are the red one at the top that is if the incumbent Republican wins, which is Trump, or if the Democratic challenger wins or the incumbent loses, and that's that dashed line at the bottom. And I drew a line here, and let me try to highlight it there. This is September 1st, and what you'll notice is, regardless of the outcome, we did see a sell-off in the market during most presidential election years in this scenario. And this gray line is the end of September, so now. And now we see where typically you would see the market take off if it believes that the Republican incumbent was going to win, or it would start selling off really hard. Now, I want to caution you from using this statistics as well, because what we saw in 2016 was a lot of people thought that the Democrat incumbent, in this case Hillary Clinton, was going to win, and we obviously know that was not the case. And we saw the same thing in 2000, which we're actually going to talk about here in a minute. But what I think is interesting is when you then look at the second year, so the first year of the presidency, so the year after the election, is you do see continued momentum traditionally if the Republican incumbent wins, but then that kind of tapers off. And what you see usually if you have a Republican losing and turning things over is the first few months are a little bit rocky, but then it's been off to the races. And actually in the first year of the presidency, you've historically seen the Democratic challenger having better stock market performance. So again, though, take this with a grain of salt. I just use this as an illustration that a lot of different things can happen, and you're not going to know until after the fact whether or not that's the case or not. So I just want you to know it does matter over the short term, but over the long term, it tends to not matter much. Now, let's talk about some of the outcomes. And one thing that I think is important is these two presidents are not as different as you think. And before you just jump off this and say, Jeff's crazy, I want to, just say, I tap into a whole lot of research. At SEM, we get stuff from Goldman Sachs and BlackRock and SEI and JP Morgan and Merrill Lynch. And I've seen so much research as well as some of the other calls that I've been on. And so I've taken kind of a approach where I've gathered all of their data and said, well, this is the consensus of what people are saying. So, and this is not talking about good or bad for the country, but specifically just the economy. So first off, good Trump. I actually, back in 2016, when after President Trump won, started talking about this thing called representativeness bias. And that's a really difficult word for me to say, which a lot of words are hard for me to say. But we look at try to make a decision based on something that looks similar. And so what we saw people doing was they looked at Republican president and said, well, therefore, this is what we think Trump is going to do. I caution people from an economic perspective was, if you took a step back, a lot of President Trump's policies on the campaign trail were actually things that Democrats for a long time had on their policy agenda. And the fact that a Republican is now saying them has kind of changed their viewpoint on them. But let's talk about some of those. So from an economic perspective, the good side of Trump, lower taxes. He's already done that once. He's talking about doing it again. I don't think many people will argue that it's a bad thing to have more money in your pockets than giving it to the government. Reduced regulations, definitely we've already seen that. He's talked about others, but we'll talk about here on the other side of the ledger, not all industries and all regulations are created equal. And there are some regulations that Donald Trump is in favor of. And then his focus on the stock market, I have never seen a president so focused on the stock market. In fact, beginning of September, he tweeted out about how the Dow Jones Industrial hit 29,000 and everybody should thank his favorite president. So far, that's the high of the year for the Dow. So he's just so laser focused. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's just we've never seen that before. And from a stock market perspective, if he continues that focus of backing off on things that the stock market doesn't like, you could see another nice rally in the market if that happens. However, there are some bad policies from an economic perspective, short term. So me saying these are bad, these are just from a short-term economic perspective. We saw this in 2018 and a little bit of 2019 with the trade war. Tariffs, that's a tax basically on consumers short term. I've said for 20 years we need to do something with the trade balance because it's hurting current generations and it's really hurting our future. So we do have to address it, but addressing it over the short term is very harmful to the economy and something that could definitely cause another recession. He has shown also tendency for heavy-handed regulation. We've seen this in technology with his rampage against tech companies and some of the things there, and we've seen it with pharmaceuticals, with some of the drug policies. Again, not saying that some of these things weren't necessary, but they are very bad from a stock market and a capitalist perspective, and some things that you don't typically see a Republican president doing. And then finally, I think even Trump's biggest supporters will say that it's been hard to see a path of the government. The administration has turned over so many different times. It's hard to keep track of who's holding the different cabinet positions. That is unsettling to the stock market and something that Wall Street has definitely talked about over the last few months in their calls heading into the election. Now, let's take the other side. What are people saying about Biden on the economy? So the good side of Biden, and gosh, I hate even saying these words. It just, to the core, it is so against what I've always believed in, but we do need more stimulus in certain places. And I think Biden is probably the one who's likely going to give it to us. And the reason I say that, and again, don't turn off this call because I hate saying these words, but the shutdown has led to a very high unemployment rate. Right now we have 2.3 unemployed people for every single job opening. So it's not a matter of, hey, you need to get off your butt and go out and work. It's literally there are not enough jobs, enough good paying jobs to pay the bills. So we got to do something for those people. But also things President Trump campaigned on, but we still have not really seen get to be in places. I've talked again for 20 years, the need for infrastructure spending. We need to invest in things that make Americans more productive. And that's something that's been on Joe Biden's agenda, from the outset. So we do need to see some spending there. That is good spending. Investing in government projects, as long as it's leading to new jobs and more productivity, can be a good thing. The other thing is, the one thing we do know about Joe Biden is he's always been somewhere in the middle. He's been good at reaching compromises, good and bad. But the market tends to like somebody who's more moderate and is able to compromise. Believe it or not, Barack Obama was considered, with hindsight, to be good at that, and that's something the market liked was he wasn't so cut and dried with everything that he did from the presidential perspective. We'll talk about something that can go wrong with that here just in a minute. And then we should see a more stable government. We probably won't see as much turnover. Again, Wall Street really likes that. They like stability and being able to predict what's going to happen next. Now, the bad side of Joe Biden, according to the Economist, this is something that happened to Barack Obama as well, who ran as a very moderate president, is we don't know the far left agenda. We don't know what Congress is going to do with that agenda. And that's a huge burden on the economy because there are a lot of policies that could be very bad, at least over the short term for the economy. There might be some good things in there for the country as a whole over the long term. We just don't know what that agenda is, and that is a big concern to a lot of economists. Then you look at, there's definitely increased regulations. That's been a platform item for 8 years now. We've seen the Democrats really wanting to push more regulations. And then finally, we've seen, an unknown cost. This is where, again, I hate saying that we need stimulus. We need stimulus that actually is productive and causes people to create growth in the economy, not just go kind of sideways like we've seen with past stimulus bills. Now, this is the most important thing to understand, is no president ever gets everything they campaigned on. And who's in Congress and what that looks like will be critical to their ability to get anything done. So yes, who's the president matters as far as vision, but what happens in Congress is much more important as far as the economy goes. Now, either way, our country is going to remain divided. I'm fascinated by these charts from Pew Research, and I've done one of our most popular blog articles is on this. And in 1994, there was not much difference between the average Republican and the average Democrat. And then what we've seen is year after year, we've seen them go further and further apart, and you've seen them both move out to the left and out to the right. That leaves a large swath of people in the middle, and that can create a very unstable base. And that's something that we've seen. This landscape going into this election is the voters are very frustrated, and I think this is very interesting. Is if you look at change elections, so we have elections every 2 years, and there's a circle every time the House, Senate, and or the White House changed hands. And what I think is fascinating is from 1960 to 1998, we only saw 7 times where we saw some sort of a change in the makeup of our government. Yet, since 2000, we've seen 8 of the 10 elections lead to some sort of change. So voters are frustrated. And I think where this comes up the most is we've seen both Republicans and Democrats lose voters in favor of independence. And we've seen Republicans pay the price early on during the George Bush years and early in the Obama years. But since then, they've actually, Democrats have lost voters. So independents are literally calling the shots. Going into this election last week, 40% of voters identified as independents. Just 3% were Democrat and 29% were Republican. Now, the problem is independents don't really have a party. There is no viable third party. So they tend to have to pick one or the other when it comes to the elections. And what we've seen historically is when they're asked, which way do you lean? Democrats over the years have had the majority of people when you count the Democratic leaning independent. But what we have seen is we've flashes where the independents were leaning Republican, and each of those times big change in the election. We've also seen changes, reversing that on the Democrat side, all those yellow boxes there. But what I think is interesting is if we start looking at the beginning of the year, the Republicans had a distinct advantage. They had more independents leaning their way. In May, at the worst of the coronavirus outbreak, you saw Democrats having a very sizable lead. Well, since that time, we've seen that lead continue to shrink. So as of last week, we're only talking about a small difference that may not be enough to swing things all the way. Because the coming months, and notice I'm not saying weeks, the election's only 5 weeks away. The coming months are going to be something that we've never experienced in our lifetimes as far as the election goes. And I think understanding this is truly going to be important as we try to make decisions with our finances, our investments, and just in general our lives. And one of the things, first off, the national polls have shown Biden leading even before coronavirus, even before Biden had won the Democratic seat or spot on the ballot. And that's fine. Hillary Clinton led the national polls against Donald Trump. The national polls do not matter when it comes to electing the president. And we can just, whenever you see this, it's a nice stat, but it truly doesn't matter. What truly matters is the Electoral College. And these polls, they were bad in 2016, and I don't think they've gotten any better going into this election. So the state polls, you have much fewer voters, fewer people willing to answer the question. You have people just not wanting to be truthful about who they're voting for. And Real Clear Politics, which kind of consolidates all of the polls, is saying it's a toss-up. You could see all the gray states there are still undecided. If you're one of those gray states, you better plan on a lot of visits from President Trump and Joe Biden in the next 5 weeks, because that is where the election's going to be cited. The other states, maybe they'll stop over as they stop for gas or something for their plane, but we probably won't see people showing up in those states because they know it's going to be decided. That's one thing Democrats learned the hard way, was Donald Trump's campaign had a very good policy to win the Electoral College, and we still have a lot of toss-up states. The issue, though, is going to be how those ballots are counted. And if you thought 2000 was bad, I don't know what this is going to be like. I mean, 2000, we just had a few counties in Florida that were question marks. Now we're going to see possibly 7 or 8 states that are too close to call. The other thing you're going to see is on election night, and probably the few days after the election, you're going to see Donald Trump leading in most votes. And that's because most people that are planning on voting have said they're going to vote in person, while most people that are going to vote for Biden are planning to vote by mail. And so we're going to see multiple jurisdictions having court battles. We're going to see those court battles go who knows how far. There's going to be back and forth. We learned that in 2000, and I think patience is going to be the key. Don't jump to conclusions about what's happening, because we honestly won't know until it's all settled out and probably decided by some sort of high-level court or courts as far as the outcome of the election goes. But one thing we can learn from 2000 is we saw a lot of back and forth. Now, going into it, a lot of people said, if George Bush wins, it's probably going to be good for the economy. Now, the stock market had already peaked and started going down. People thought George Bush would be a net positive and Al Gore would be a net negative because of some of the things that both of them campaigned on. And what we saw happening during the fight, For those, just a quick recap, there was a lot of questionable ballots, so they were having to do count after recount. And finally, during that fight, if Bush was coming out on top of Raleigh, and if Gore was coming out on top of Sella, the Florida, when the election commissioner certified the election in favor of Bush, you saw, a bit of a rally, but then the court ordered a recount. And then it went back and forth. What was ironic was when the Supreme Court finally stepped in and said, we're calling it no more recounts, it goes to Bush, the market actually sold off 8%. So even though going in, everybody said Bush would be good for the stock market, that the market, for whatever reason, decided, so keep this chart in mind because it's likely going to be a lot worse and more volatility as we come into the weeks after the election. Now, the bigger issue, as I already said, is what happens in Congress is very up in the air. And you still see 7 seats are up for grabs. Some quick math there. That means it could be 53 Democrats or 54% Republican, somewhere in between. I heard somebody say the most 2020 thing that could happen overall is we could have a tie in the Electoral College. We could see the House delegates tied because not every person gets to vote in the House. But we could see those tied, and we could see a tie in the Senate. And who knows? We could even see a toss-up in the Supreme Court. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But hey, it's 2020. What else would you expect? Now, this is most important: is what's SEM's plan? Because I've talked about a whole lot of things that could go wrong. Things could go good. Somewhere in between. For 28 years, we've been handling the unknown, and we do it based on data. We do it, most importantly, with the basis of a financial plan and a cash flow strategy. So those become the core of every investment decision that we make, is how do the investments tie into the plan? Now, things that happen in the election could most definitely influence your plan, but they're not going to happen on election night. They're not going to happen in December. They're going to have to be laws that are passed, and then your financial plan and cash flow strategy can be adjusted and your portfolio adjusted accordingly. What SEM's going to do is follow the data. Our tactical systems, I put up an example here. This is our high yield bond trend following. It's our most conservative system because it looks to get out most quickly. It's already said, I don't like volatility. I'm going to take money to the sideline. So if the market starts getting too choppy and the trends start reversing, we fully expect to pull as much money off the table as the systems dictate, and then be ready to apply those going in. But we just don't know what's going to happen, so it makes no sense to give up some potentially huge gains in the market if we're just guessing. So there are no politics involved in what we do. I've shown this chart over and over again. It's how we handled the coronavirus pandemic, and it's the same way we plan on handling this. It's the same way we've handled past panics in the market. Is we have a plan for whatever happens. Our systems are designed to work in steps. So it's not taking all the money out at once. It's not putting it all back into there at the same time. I'm going to close with a quote that I had to start using back in 2000. And it's simply, don't let your political opinions influence your investment decisions. It's going to be a heated 5 weeks. It's going to be probably a heated 3 months as the election gets decided. I know we each believe strongly in our own political opinions, but the data shows that in the long run, it does not matter. The markets will work things out. SEM will take care of those things, those bumps in the road as much as we can. So please, I understand. Look, we're all Americans. It shouldn't be Republican or Democrat or independent. We're all Americans, and I think we're going to get through this. We just got to put our political opinions aside and let our investments do what they're supposed to be doing. So before I turn it back over for questions, I want to encourage you, semwealth.com, go to the blog links there that I've highlighted on the screen, because we're going to be updating throughout what's happening. There's also the subscribe button. If you're not getting our updates, go ahead and subscribe. Also, we have our risk questionnaire, and if you're an advisor and you want to get a quick checkup on your clients, have them take that questionnaire. If you're a client and you want a quick checkup on your account, take that there, because that's what matters more than who's president, who's in Congress, is what your financial plan says and if you're on track for that plan. So with that, we do have about 5 minutes for questions. So I'll go ahead and ask Courtney to see what we have in the queue.
So we actually have quite a few. I'll just start at the top. What is the worst case scenario for the economy after the election?
Well, the worst case scenario is definitely what I think is a scenario for either candidate is we go back into a recession, or we don't quite go into a recession, but we have a big stock market sell-off. Because I remind people that the recession ended in 2001 in November after 9/11. We were in technically an economic expansion in 2002, but from high to low, from January to late September, we saw a 32% drop in the stock market. So worst case scenario is whatever the damage that was done by the coronavirus carries through regardless of who wins, and we do go back into another recession, which leads to bigger stock market losses.
Okay, next is, do you anticipate heightened regulations if Biden wins?
Yes, he does have some executive orders he can do. We saw Donald Trump do the same thing. We also could definitely see their agenda has a lot of regulations that could be voted on by Congress. So again, economically, short-term regulations can be bad, but long-term, depending on how they're written, there might be some that could help the economy. And I'm not going to guess what they are. We will do, after the election, we kind of know, we'll do another one of these SEM universities to discuss some specific policies. But yeah, I think it's a given that we'd see more regulation.
Okay, if Trump does actually have that huge personal debt and he defaults on it during his second term, would this affect the economy?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, $400 million of personal loan guarantees, I believe, was the number. I don't know that I know we haven't seen anything like that. I think if it becomes an issue of, is this going to be another impeachment? Is there investigations? The market doesn't like anything like that. That would, so assuming he's elected, that could have definitely consequences on things. But I mean, he brushed off other investigations. Bill Clinton brushed off personal investigations into his life. I guess it comes down to whether he's impeached or not, again.
Another Trump question, will Trump's manufacturing policies help to reduce the debt load long term?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by policies. If we're talking about getting tariffs done, and bringing jobs back to America, absolutely that helps reduce our debt. Because if you think about it, when you just think of your household, if you borrow money to then go spend at a store and then have to pay that money back, that's less money that you have. But if you're investing, and that's why I said infrastructure, we have some pharmaceutical plants that can be upgraded, and we can bring pharmaceutical manufacturing back here. We have a lot of things that we can do. So that money leads to U.S. job growth, and if that's just more money staying in the U.S., so that means we have to borrow less. So yeah, absolutely. If we manufacture more stuff here long term, our debt goes down.
Okay, and we do still have 4 or 5 questions if you're wanting to try to get through all of those.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do it.
I understand that some stimulus would be good, especially given the impact to the economy during COVID, but how are we going to pay for it?
We're theoretically you can pay through it from growth, and that's why I said investing. Things to if we use stimulus to retrofit a manufacturing plant and that creates jobs, that starts paying for itself. The issue is if you do stimulus that does not turn into growth, and that's the way we're going to have to pay for it, unfortunately, down the road is going to be higher taxes. We have fewer people working in the current working generation than we do the retired generation. So theoretically, you pay it back through growth. We just need both sides to realize that it's okay to use debt to stimulate, so long as when we do have the growth, you pay it back. So preferably, we pay it back in chunks, just along the way in a pattern, not being forced to pay it back by, the bond market just saying we're done lending you money. But I don't think that's a possibility, at least in the next 5 years.
Okay, this one is kind of similar. We have failed to pay off U.S. debt during times of prosperity. That stated, will additional stimulus be more harmful than helpful?
Yeah, long term, it could definitely be more harmful, but sustained long-term unemployment can just be something that we never get out of. So going back into a recession needs to be something that we try to avoid as much as possible. And we're going to see this air pocket and economic data is going to come in. I 100% agree that we can't just keep doing it, but we just kind of have to bridge the gap of those able to work at no fault of their own, make sure we don't put them into bankruptcy, and then start figuring out how we pay it back. Preferably we pay it back again. My platform would be retrofit these manufacturing plants, bring back manufacturing jobs if it has to be via tariffs, whatever it is, give incentives to people hiring US workers to produce things here. That type of spending could literally pay itself back in 10 years because we'd be getting higher growth and higher tax revenue.
Okay, if I need cash for quarterly tax payment in December, should I get my cash prior to the election?
Well, at SEM, we always say, you shouldn't invest money that you need in the next 12 months in any type of the market. So I personally, if we're talking now 3 months down the road, I would definitely say, look, stocks are still within 5% of their highs. I would pull that aside, and depending on your financial plan, we'd like to have 12 months worth of expenses, including your estimated taxes, sitting aside somewhere else. So yeah, money needed in 3 months when the market's already close to its all-time highs is better than if it's not. If you're going 3 months out, you're literally just gambling that money, because I couldn't tell you if the market's going to be higher or lower from today.
Okay, last two questions. In term president, the stock market doesn't like uncertainty. Usually that would mean challenger, but with having one of the lowest approval ratings of a president running for re-election and being the underdog, would re-election actually be the uncertainty scenario short term?
Yeah, I think that would be a surprise. Although every call I've been on with Wall Street has said, don't underestimate the president's ability to get the electoral college votes to go his way. Wall Street right now is saying they believe the market would prefer Biden just because of stability. So, that's really a question I don't think we'll know the answer to. But in general, what Wall Street is saying is Biden seems to be the more stable choice. If Trump does win, it does create uncertainty. Because the one thing that, and I respect a lot of the policies that President Trump has done, and I disagree with some of the policies that he's done. But we've seen candidate Trump turn into, the good economic policies in his first couple of years, back to candidate Trump really the last 18 months. I think even Trump's biggest supporters will say, that he's his #1 fan, and he truly believes with his whole heart that his ideas are really good ideas, and he wants America and history to do that. So we don't know what legacy President Trump is going to be like, and that's one thing Wall Street has said is he's doing a lot of things now just to win re-election. If he knows he has 4 years to create his legacy, he might be pulling in some of the more uncertain things. So that's, I agree with the person who asked the question of it could be, ironically, the incumbent winning is the more uncertain outlook.
Okay, last question. It seems like every year is getting worse. How are we supposed to heal our country?
Definitely. I showed the numbers with the polls. The one thing that I did another call a little bit earlier, this book called Generations, The History of America's Future, William Strauss and Neil Howe. I was looking for something else, and I just happened to flip to a page, and at the bottom of the page it says, enter the crisis of 2020. And for those of you who haven't heard me talk about the social cycle, the copyright date on this book is 1991, and this is that print. Our country goes in cycles, and I don't have time to do this. Maybe we'll do another SEM University on it, but we've had times where we're so divided, and it seems like the worst, is still to come. Like we're just never going to get better again. These 80 to 90 year cycles have occurred now. You go back, you had the Great Depression, World War II. You go back before that, you had the Civil War, and before that, you had the Revolutionary War, and then even before that, you actually had our forefathers when they had a lot of unrest in England that they decided to come to America. So studying history and this book makes me firmly believe that we are definitely in a crisis and things could get worse, but Americans have always found a way to come together. And I fully believe we're going to do that. Again, 100 million people who did not vote and could have last time are now getting, part of the process. This year's been ugly, but that doesn't mean 2022 can't be a little bit better. So I am a huge believer in America, regardless of what political party is in control. I think history tells me we're going to find a way to come together, and that's all we have to go on. But just know I end everything. We're not Republicans, we're not Democrats, we're Americans. Please remember that. We thank you for the time. Thank you for letting us run a little bit over. We appreciate the questions. If you have any further questions, you can find our contact information at semwealth.com. You can also find us on social media. Again, tradersblog.semwealth.com, all the updates there as we go throughout this. Stay calm, take a deep breath. I don't think our country's ending. I think we have better days ahead of us. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.